If you've never heard a story that'll change how you see the world, stick around and hit that subscribe button, because this one will leave you speechless. Give this video a thumbs up if you believe in second chances, and let's dive into a tale from 1887 that proves sometimes the quietest voices carry the loudest hearts. My name is Samuel Hayes, and I reckon I should start this story the way it needs telling, with the truth, raw and unvarnished as a winter morning in Wyoming territory. It was March of 1887 when I first laid eyes on her, though calling it laying eyes doesn't do justice to what happened in my chest that day. I'd ridden into Deadwood Gulch with nothing but $43 in my pocket, a worn-out horse named Chester, and boots that had seen more miles than most men see in a lifetime. The town was alive with the usual chaos: miners stumbling drunk from the saloons, card games spilling onto the wooden sidewalks, and the constant sound of hammers building this settlement faster than good sense could keep up. The Red Horse Saloon stood at the corner of Main and Silver Street, its painted sin creaking in the wind like an old gate. I wasn't planning to go inside. Seen enough saloons to know they rarely held anything good for a man trying to keep his head straight. But the crowd gathered outside caught my attention. There had to be 50 men there, all talking at once, money changing hands. And in the center of it all stood Big Jim Crawford. Crawford was the kind of man who made his living off other people's misery. 6 feet tall, with hands like ham hocks and a voice that could crack stone. He owned half the businesses in Deadwood Gulch and had his fingers in everything from cattle rustling to claim jumping. If there was corruption to be found, Crawford was either behind it or taking a cut. Gentlemen, Crawford's voice boomed over the crowd. We got ourselves a situation here that needs resolving, and I'm the man to resolve it. I pushed through the crowd, my curiosity getting the better of my good judgment. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, standing on a wooden crate in front of the saloon, was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. But beautiful wasn't the word that came to mind. First, it was broken. Her dark hair hung in tangled waves. Around her shoulders, her green dress was torn at the hem and stained with God knows what, and her hands were bound with rough rope. But it was her eyes that hit me like a punch to the gut, green as spring grass, wide with fear. But underneath that fear was something else, a fierce determination that told me this woman wasn't going down without a fight, and she was, with child. Here is Martha Sinclair, Crawford announced, walking around her like she was livestock. Found her stealing bread from Henderson's store this morning. Now, normally, we'd just throw a thief in jail, but Martha here's got herself a problem. Carrying a child and ain't got a husband to speak of. The crowd murmured, some men laughing, others making crude comments that made my hands ball into fists. So, Crawford continued, I'm proposing a solution that benefits everyone. Martha needs someone to take care of her, and that baby she's carrying. Some of you fine gentlemen might need yourselves a woman to cook and clean and provide other ... services. So we're gonna have ourselves an auction. They were going to sell her like cattle. Martha's chin lifted, and even from where I stood, I could see the fire in her eyes. I won't be sold to any of you animals, she said, her voice clear and strong despite the tremor I could hear underneath. Crawford backhanded her across the face, and the sound echoed through the crowd like a gunshot. Several men cheered. That's when something inside me snapped. I'd spent 32 years on this earth, most of them trying to mind my own business and stay out of trouble. I'd been a soldier in the war, a cattle driver, a railroad worker, and a dozen other things, but I'd never been the kind of man who stuck his neck out for strangers. My daddy always said the world was full of people in trouble, and if you tried to help them all, you'd end up in trouble yourself. But seeing that woman Martha standing there, with blood trickling from her lip and her hands bound, carrying a child and facing a fate worse than death, I knew I couldn't walk away. Bidding starts at $20, Crawford shouted. Who wants to start us off? Hands shot up around the crowd. 25, someone called. 30. Came another voice. I watched Martha's face as the numbers climbed. With each bid, I saw a little more of her hope die. $40, $50, $60, $75. The voice belonged to Black Pete Morrison, a man who was known for his cruelty to women and his love of whiskey. I'd heard stories about Pete that would make a decent man sick to his stomach. Martha looked directly at Pete, and I saw her whole body shudder. The bidding slowed. $75 was more money than most men in Deadwood Gulch saw in 3 months. Crawford looked around the crowd, grinning like a cat with cream. 75 going once, going twice, ... That's when I raised my hand. $100. The crowd went silent. Crawford's grin faltered, and every head turned to look at me. I was just another dusty cowboy in worn-out clothes, but I'd spoken with authority, and my hand was steady in the air. Well, Crawford said, studying me like I was something he'd found stuck to his boot. Looks like we got ourselves a new bidder. You got that kind of money, stranger? I reached into my pocket and pulled out every dollar I owned in the world. $43. It wasn't even half of what I'd bid, but I held it up where everyone could see. I'll have the rest by morning, I said. Praying, my voice sounded more confident than I felt. Crawford laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. That ain't how auctions work, cowboy. You got the money or you don't. I've got 43 here, I said, stepping forward, and I'll have the rest by sunup tomorrow. You got my word on it. Your word, Crawford spat. I don't even know your name. Samuel Hayes, I said, and my word's worth more than most men's gold. The crowd was watching this exchange like it was better entertainment than anything they'd see in the saloon. Martha was staring at me too, but I couldn't read the expression on her face. Crawford looked around at the other bidders, but nobody was raising their hands. $100 was serious money, more than anyone had expected to pay. All right, Hayes, Crawford said finally. You got until sunup to come up with my money. But if you don't, tant ... He let the threat hang in the air. I'll have it, I said. Crawford nodded to 2 of his men, who cut Martha's bonds and pushed her toward me. She stumbled, and I caught her arm to steady her. The moment my hand touched hers, I felt something I'd never felt before, like lightning running through my veins. She looked up at me, those green eyes searching my face. Why? She whispered. I didn't have an answer for her. Not one that made sense anyway. So I just said the truth, because it was the right thing to do. I took Martha to the Deadwood Inn, the only decent place in town. The room cost $2 money. I couldn't spare, but she needed safety more than I needed those coins. As we climbed the stairs, she told me her story. Martha had been married to a man named Thomas, a farmer who'd brought her west from Missouri with promises of land and a new life. But Thomas had been a dreamer and a poor judge of character. He'd invested everything they had in a mining claim that turned out to be worthless, sold to him by a con man who'd disappeared with their money. Thomas had started drinking, then gambling, trying to win back what they'd lost. When Martha found out she was pregnant, Thomas had seemed to get better for a while, but it didn't last. 3 weeks ago, he'd ridden out to try his luck at the poker tables in the next town over. His body was found 2 days later in a creek, shot through the heart. The debts didn't die with him, Martha said, sitting on the edge of the bed in a small room. Crawford owns most of them now. He came to the farm and took everything, the house, the livestock, even my wedding ring. Said I could work off the debt in his saloon or go to jail for theft. So you ran. I tried to. Made it 3 days before hunger caught up with me. She touched her belly gently. I couldn't let the baby starve because of my pride. I felt that. Familiar anger building in my chest, the same rage that had made me raise my hand at the auction. Crawford wasn't just a criminal. He was a predator who fed on people's desperation. What about you? Martha asked. What's your story, and why are you willing to risk everything for a stranger? I thought about my life, 32 years of drifting from job to job, town to town, never putting down roots because I'd never found anything worth staying for. I'd been born in Texas, fought for the Confederacy when I was barely old enough to hold a rifle, then spent the years after the war trying to forget what I'd seen and done. I've been looking for something, I said finally. Never knew what it was until today. And what did you find today? Purpose, I reckon. That night, I left Martha at the hotel and made my way to Murphy's poker game. It was my only chance to get the money I'd promised Crawford. The game was already in full swing when I arrived, 6 men around a table, including Murphy himself and, to my dismay, 2 of Crawford's associates. I bought in with $20, leaving me with $21 to my name. For the first hour, I played conservative, learning the tells and habits of the other players. By 10 o'clock, I'd worked my $20 up to $35. Not enough, but progress. That's when Crawford himself walked into the room. The stakes got higher immediately. Crawford played like a man who was used to winning, betting aggressively and using his size and reputation to intimidate the other players. But I'd faced scarier men than Crawford during the war, and I had something he didn't: desperation and a reason to fight. The crucial hand came near midnight. The pot had grown to over $200. I was holding a pair of kings, which wasn't great, but it wasn't terrible either. Crawford looked at his cards, then at me. Tell you what, Hayes, he said, his voice casual but his eyes sharp. I'll make you a deal. You fold right now, and I'll cut your debt in half. $50 instead of $100. It was a tempting offer, but I thought about Martha, alone in that hotel room, carrying a child and depending on me. I thought about the fear in her eyes when Black Pete Morrison had bid on her. I'll see your bet, I said, and raise you 20. Crawford's smile faltered. Around the table, the other players folded until it was just the 2 of us. Call, Crawford said. I laid down my kings. Crawford stared at them for a long moment, then threw his cards face down on the table. Kings win, Murphy announced. I reached for the pot with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. $237. More money than I'd ever seen at one time. Crawford stood up slowly. Interesting game, Hayes, he said. Seems like you're full of surprises. Sometimes a man gets lucky, I said. Sometimes, Crawford agreed. But his eyes promised that my luck wouldn't last forever. The next morning, I met Crawford at the Red Horse Saloon to settle our debt. But when I arrived, he had a different proposition. You know, Hayes, he said, sipping his coffee like we were old friends, I've been thinking about you all night. That was quite a performance at the poker table. I put the $100 on the table between us. Our business is done. Crawford didn't touch the money. Actually, it's not. See, I've been doing some calculating, and it turns out Martha Sinclair owes me a lot more than we originally discussed. My blood went cold. What are you talking about? Interest, Hayes. Compound interest on her late husband's debts. By my calculations, she owes me close to $300 now. He pulled out a sheet of paper covered in legal language. Tom Sinclair's signature was clear at the bottom, agreeing to a 20% monthly interest rate that had been growing for 6 months. Even if that's legal, I said, I want it fair and square. Ah, but you see, I never actually agreed to let you pay off her debt with poker winnings. Our original agreement was that you'd pay me $100 by sunrise. It's past sunrise now. I was trapped, and Crawford knew it. But I'd been trapped before during the war, when Confederate lines collapsed and Union forces surrounded us. Sometimes the only way out of a trap was to spring it yourself. What do you want? I asked. You work my mines for a year, and I'll consider both debts paid, or I have Sheriff Morrison arrest you for theft. That money you won last night, some of it belonged to my associates. They're claiming you cheated. Sheriff Morrison was Black Pete's brother, just as corrupt as his sibling. If Crawford wanted me arrested, I'd be in jail within the hour. I looked at the money on the table, then at Crawford's smug face. I need time to think about it. You've got until noon. Bring your wife with you when you come back. I want her to. Hear your decision. I made it back to the hotel, my mind churning with possibilities. Martha was dressed and waiting when I walked through the door. What happened? She asked immediately. I told her everything Offord's new demands, the interest on her husband's debt, the threat of arrest. With each word, I watched her face grow paler. $300, she whispered. Samuel, that's impossible. We're not going to pay it, I said. We're leaving, right now. But he'll come after us. Crawford has men everywhere. I went to the window and looked down at the street. 2 of Crawford's men were loitering near the hotel entrance. Not if he's too busy dealing with other problems. Her eyes widened. What kind of problems? The kind that happen when someone burns down his warehouse. Crawford kept all his business records in that warehouse, contracts, debt agreements, everything. Without those papers, he couldn't prove Martha owed him anything. Samuel, that's arson. If you get caught, then you take that money and run. Martha grabbed my arm. No, we stick together. Whatever happens, we face it together. Looking into her eyes, I realized that somewhere in the last 2 days, I'd fallen completely in love with her. Together then, I said. We spent the afternoon making preparations. As noon approached, we gathered our belongings and prepared to leave the hotel. Martha had changed into her best dress and braided her hair back. She looked like a lady heading to church, not a woman about to help her husband commit arson. Ready? I asked. She took my hand. Ready. The warehouse stood at the edge of town like a sleeping giant. We waited until dark, then made our move. The back window had a broken latch, probably from the last storm. I boosted Martha up first, then climbed through myself. Inside, the warehouse was pitch black and smelled of dust and old paper. I'd brought a small lantern, but I didn't dare light it until we found Crawford's office. The office was exactly what I'd expected her. Desk covered with papers, filing cabinets along the walls, and a safe in the corner. I lit the lantern, keeping the flame low in the bottom drawer of the desk. I found what we were looking for, A thick folder, labeled Outstanding Debts, contained dozens of documents, including several with Tom Sinclair's name. There were the original debt agreements, interest calculations, and even a note in Crawford's handwriting about leveraging the widow's situation. "This is it," I told Martha. "Without these, Crawford can't prove you owe him anything." We gathered every document that mentioned the Sinclair name. Then I poured kerosene around the office, soaking the remaining papers and wooden furniture. "Samuel," Martha said softly, "once we do this, there's no going back." "I know." I struck a match and held it for a moment, the tiny flame dancing in the darkness. This was it, the moment that would either free us or destroy us. I dropped the match. The kerosene caught immediately, flames racing across the floor and up the walls. We ran for the window as the fire spread behind us, leaping through the opening and into the cool night air. By the time we reached our horses, hidden in the trees outside town, the warehouse was fully engulfed. Orange flames licked at the night sky, and we could hear shouting from the direction of Deadwood Gulch. "Samuel," Martha said as we mounted up, "I need to tell you something." "What is it?" "I'm not just pregnant." She took my hand and placed it on her belly. "I can feel the baby moving. Strong kicks, like he's ready to fight the world." She smiled, the first genuine happiness I'd seen from her. Call it mother's intuition. We rode hard through the night, putting as much distance as possible between us and Crawford's reach. By dawn, we were 50 miles from Deadwood Gulch, in territory that Crawford didn't control. 3 months later, we were married by a circuit preacher in a little town called Hope Springs. Martha wore a white dress we'd bought with some of our remaining money, and I wore my best shirt, cleaned and pressed for the occasion. "Do you, Samuel Hayes, take Martha to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do. Do you, Martha Sinclair, take Samuel to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do." When the preacher pronounced us husband and wife, I kissed her like my life depended on it. Because, in a way, it did. We used the rest of our money to buy a small piece of land. Outside Hope Springs, 20 acres of good soil with a creek running through it. It wasn't much, but it was ours. I built us a cabin with my own hands, working from dawn to dusk while Martha tended a small garden and prepared for the baby. On a cold December morning, with snow falling outside our cabin, Martha gave birth to our son. She'd been right, he was a fighter from the moment he drew breath, crying loud enough to wake the dead. "What should we call him?" Martha asked, exhausted but radiant as she held our boy. I looked at the tiny face, red and wrinkled, and perfect. "Thomas," I said, "after your first husband. He may not have been perfect, but he brought you west, and that led you to me." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "Thomas Samuel Hayes," she said, "Tommy for short," as I held my wife and son in our little cabin, with the snow falling outside and the fire crackling in the hearth. I thought about that day in Deadwood Gulch. I'd raised my hand not knowing what it would cost me, but it had given me everything worth having. We never heard from Crawford again. Word reached us a year later that he'd left Deadwood Gulch after a series of unfortunate business losses. His warehouse fire had destroyed more than just paperwork, had unraveled his entire network of corruption. Tommy grew up strong and smart, with his mother's green eyes and what Martha claimed was my stubborn streak. We had 2 more children after him, a daughter we named Grace and another son we called William. Our little farm prospered, and Hope Springs became home in a way no place had ever been for me. Sometimes On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep, Martha and I would sit on our porch and talk about that day in Deadwood Gulch. She'd ask me again why I'd raised my hand, risked everything for a stranger, and I'd give her the same answer. I'd given her that first day because it was the right thing to do, but the truth was more complicated than that. I'd raised my hand because I'd seen something in her eyes, a strength that refused to be broken, a dignity that couldn't be sold. I'd raised my hand because I'd recognized something in her that I'd been searching for my whole life without knowing it. I'd raised my hand because sometimes, if you're lucky, you get one moment that changes everything. One chance to step up and be the man you always hoped you could be. And if you're really lucky, that moment leads to a lifetime of other moments, quiet mornings with the woman you love, children's laughter echoing through your home, and the peace that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. That's the story of how I met my wife at an auction, bought her freedom with a poker game, and found my own freedom in the process. It's a story about taking chances, standing up for what's right, and learning that sometimes the best things in life come from the moments when you stop thinking and start acting from the heart. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that there's still good in this world worth fighting for, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button if you believe in second chances and the power of doing what's right, even when it costs you everything. Sometimes the smallest actions can change the course of two lives forever. And I hope this story inspires you to look for those moments in your own life. Until next time, remember that heroes aren't born. They're made in the moments when ordinary people decide to do extraordinary things.